Hello people of YouTube.
Alright, I want to start with another video.
People don't like foreigners coming in. I know people didn't like me when I came here as a refugee from the Nazis. I escaped. Many millions didn't. I never saw my father again, nor my brother. When Hitler came after the Jews, we had no legal rights to go into any other country. 60 years ago, Britain signed up to the Refugee Convention. That's why people running away from persecution have a right to come to Britain.
Pause for emotional effects.
I was a child.
I was a child,
There was war.
and we were persecuted.
I had to get out
I had to get out
to save my life.
to save my life.
Thanks to the Refugee Convention, me and my family survived.
I became a nurse.
One day, I'll play basketball for Scotland.
This is a little corny.
And if he doesn't take off his phone, it's not like he's gonna lose his phone.
It's obviously a very emotive issue, but look, made by many refugees. Alright, let's get started. So this issue around refugees, it's obviously highly emotive. This is a cartoon which briefly captures one cartoonist's view about what Australia is trying to do with our current procedure for refugees. All we're interested for now is, of course, Indonesia's response, because we're looking at Indonesia's national interest, what Indonesia has done to achieve its national interests, so its refugee policy. Just a quick summary of what we've done thus far, and where we're going from here. So this will be today. Friday, we'll look at the international community, and anti-terrorism will be about a 10-minute presentation, because we've already done this when we've done Jamara Islamiyah and Detachment 88. So this one is really a very short one. So we'll end up finishing this pretty quickly, end of this week. Some background to this refugee issue. This map captures the number of refugees in Africa. The largest circles represent 600,000 refugees. And you can see there are quite a few scattered across Africa. So Australia takes in about 15,000 to 20,000 each year. There are countries in Africa which have 600,000 in their country right now. More specifically, looking at East Africa, these big red circles are the number of just Somalian refugees in the surrounding countries. So these are people who have fled Somalia because they fear persecution. There are 520,000 Somalian refugees in Kenya alone. So it gives you a bit of perspective on how many people we're talking about looking for new homes, who can't go back to where they used to live for fear of persecution. Because what makes a refugee isn't that they're poor. This isn't an issue of poverty. You can be really wealthy and still be a refugee. It's about a fear of persecution. And so obviously Somalia has had enormous internal conflict, huge numbers of people have fled, and now these mostly poor countries have to try and deal with hundreds of thousands of refugees who have nowhere else to go. A little more specifically in our part of the world, this is a map which captures some of the places from which boats depart Indonesia on their way to Australia. Now Christmas Island sits here. This is Australian territory. If you're in Christmas Island, you're in Australia. You can see it's about 150 kilometres, 200 kilometres tops from Indonesia. So most boats that depart Indonesia tend to aim for Christmas Island, because once they get here, they're in Australia, and then they can say, I'm seeking asylum, I want protection, can you help me? And that's when we put in place our refugee processes and do what we do. But of course, there are lots of places from which they can depart, and other than Christmas Island, Ashmore Reef is also a part of Australia, and we've got Darwin pretty close as well.
Is that the scale?
I believe so.
Pretty close.
Yes, it's very close. I think it's about an 8-hour boat trip on one of those shoddy little wooden boats. So you're not on the boat for long. Alright.
Can they then say that they're seeking asylum?
Nope, because you have to actually arrive in a foreign territory before you can say, I'm seeking asylum.
If you're in their waters, though?
Nope. No, they have to get here. But once they're in our waters, Australia can't take the boat outside of our waters. So like international law states that we can't tell a boat where to go. Boats, there's freedom of movement on the open seas. It's only when you land on land that then action takes place. All right, some of the broader issues globally, about 10.5 million refugees. I have some more figures somewhere. Internally displaced people. This refers to people who are within their own country, but they're internally displaced. They can't stay where their homes are. So often in Australia we have large floods or bushfires. We have internally displaced people. They can't stay in their homes. Globally, we've got about 15.5 million people who can't be where they want to be. Claims of asylum. So 750,000 people are claiming asylum, which means they've left their country, they've gone to another country, and they've said, I want to claim asylum, I want to seek protection from your country. So everyone who arrives in Australia, when they first get here, they're not refugees, they're asylum seekers, they're looking for protection. So if you seek asylum, you're seeking protection. So that's the backlog, that's the waiting list. When people talk about the waiting list, that's the list. And when a new person says, I'm seeking asylum, they go to the bottom of that list. It's a big list. A few key words: an asylum seeker, a person who fears persecution within their country and seeks protection in another state. It's really hard for us to fathom something like this because, I can't think of many groups in Australia in this position. A refugee, a person whose fear of persecution has been recognised by a body like UNHCR, they may be in a new state. So once you've been processed, everyone, they look at your background, the individual situation, you can get refugee status. So you want to end up being a refugee, and that's when, in Australia's case, you can stay. Once you've been approved as a refugee, then you can stay. Up until that point, you're an asylum seeker, and we investigate. There's a great video which looks at what is a refugee. It's about South Africa.
Shall be the policy of this nation.
So obviously all three videos you've seen thus far are about trying to inform the public. They've all got a particular perspective. As that one did, it was trying to give South Africans an idea of what refugees are actually entitled to do. The final term is a migrant. Most people who move around are migrants. So these are people who come and go from different countries for reasons not related to persecution. So employment, family, study. So, when you move to another country to work, you're a migrant. When you go overseas, you might stay somewhere for a couple of years with family, you're a migrant. So there's a big distinction between people who move for personal reasons out of choice, and people who flee their country out of fear of persecution, out of being punished. And it's a distinction we often forget in this debate. And the last bit of context to this issue is that we actually have 2 international treaties. So World War II, huge displacement of people, massive, millions if not tens of millions of people who moved particularly around Europe. They couldn't be in their homes. You know, if you were anywhere in Belgium, France, Italy, you left. You found somewhere safe to be. As a result, once the UN was formed, they realised one of their priorities was they needed to protect these people. So in future conflicts, we could protect civilians who have to flee their homes. And that's why they signed the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And this outlined the reasons that you could flee your home and seek protection in another state. And so there's a whole series of clauses. We're not going to look at it with this topic now. We'll look at it when we do refugees towards the middle of term 3. But part of the context is that we have an international treaty that most states have signed. And I'll show you a map in a second.
Wait, I don't really understand. Like, I understand where refugees come from, like Africa and stuff. But like, why are they all coming from Indonesia?
Good question. Almost none of them are Indonesians. They're coming from somewhere else. And Indonesia hasn't signed these treaties. So Indonesia doesn't protect refugees. And that's why they come to us on boats, because we do.
So where are they from?
Oh, yeah, they're from the Middle East. Some from Africa, but most of them aren't from Africa.
Why does the Middle East like come all the way?
Oh, we'll see the map in a second. It's because so few states between us and, let's say, Afghanistan, almost none of those states have signed the refugee treaty. So if they went to one of them, they're not safe. And they go to the next one, the next one. We're one of the few states in this region who have actually signed these treaties. So if you're fleeing your home and you want to be recognised as a refugee, you've got to keep going till you find a state which recognises these treaties. And we have. I think that is the next. No, it's not the next slide. All right. So why is this an issue for Indonesia? You've got a cartoon there where you've got an Australian politician, an Indonesian politician. The Indonesian guy says, we've got millions of refugees already. And the Aussie guy is saying, well, then you won't notice a few more. Because a part of our policy is to try and keep them in Indonesia and stop them getting here. Why is it an issue for Indonesia? Well, they host a large number of refugees. So there are about 3,000 there now. There are about 3,000 asylum seekers. But it's also an issue because, as we know, the asylum seekers who are arriving in Australia by boat are almost entirely coming from Indonesia. So this is a regional issue. We've talked about issues that require a multilateral resolution. This is one of them. We can't solve this problem alone. Indonesia can't solve this problem alone. It requires many states, multilaterally. So it's an issue for Indonesia because it's an issue for us. They're our neighbours. They know we're concerned with this. Something's going to have to happen. It's an issue because we've got this tension between sovereignty. So remember, let's go back to definition of sovereignty. Power and authority over your territory and people. If boats are coming and going, you no longer have control over your territory. So there are sovereignty issues. And the other side of that debate is the one about multilateral resolution. States working together to try and find a solution. And that's what those treaties seek to do. So that's another reason why it's an issue for Indonesia. There's a concern that if you sign international treaties, you can actually be held accountable to them. Just like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, if you start making nuclear weapons, UN Security Council is going to have a freak out. It's the same with all treaties. Once you sign an international treaty, someone's going to want to hold you accountable. So one solution is to not sign the treaties. You know, do you pursue your own solution, protect your sovereignty, something that works for you, or do you sign up to something which you might have to do things that you don't particularly like? And we've got this quote from UNHCR. In Indonesia and Malaysia, UNHCR has faced a steady increase in the number of new arrivals in recent years. The challenge in these countries is to deliver protection in an environment of mixed migration that lacks legal frameworks. for dealing with refugees. So in contrast, Australia has a pretty clear legal framework. We abide by the UN Convention. And in Australian law, international treaties always take precedence over national laws. So we have to abide by the terms of a treaty first, and then we can pass our own national laws, so long as they don't clash with international treaties. Of course, if you don't sign the treaty, then you can pass whatever laws you like. And that's this thing here about a lack of legal framework. So Indonesia's response. This map shows us which states have signed those two treaties. So the dark green states are states that have signed both the convention and the protocols. They're two treaties that go together. You can see the problem we've got in Southeast Asia. Almost no one has signed them. And so you've got these huge trouble spots in the world through here. Massive displacement, particularly caused by the Iraq and Afghanistan war. Huge numbers of people fleeing, and many of them are travelling down through Indonesia into Australia. Now, to put it in perspective, as we saw on the previous graph, you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in some of these countries. You've got 4,000 or 5,000 arriving in Australia by boat. So we're not talking about huge numbers of people, but in a way that's irrelevant. It's still people arriving here. It's political.
What's the color of green one?
That's someone who has signed one half of the treaty, not the other half.
The other one.
They've signed the other half. There's two treaties.
Okay.
So these guys have signed the 1951,
What country is the green one?
1967, Madagascar. So Indonesia's response is to not sign the treaty. Take a guess which other country which protects its sovereignty vehemently has also not signed the 1967 treaty? The US. Yeah. So another state which hasn't signed the treaty is the US, for the same reason. It wants to protect its ability to pass laws to control its own territory, rather than being subservient to the UN and what it dictates is the right thing to do. But Indonesia, they haven't signed either of the treaties.
How does it benefit them if they sign the treaty, apart from looking at the good information? I know.
It's a good question. How does it benefit them? Look, in a way it doesn't.
Apart from the morality, but
And that's the answer. It's, I think people who like the treaty would say it's for the moral reasons, it's for the humanitarian reasons. And we're going to compare soon universal principles versus sovereign principles. So it's the idea that some people believe there are certain universal human rights that we should protect, and that's known as idealism, and then there's pragmatism. So we've got those two terms. A pragmatist says, no, the state does what is in the state's best interest. There is no such thing as universal anything. The state seeks power at all costs, and we don't care about anything else. So this is a perfect issue to do idealism and pragmatism, and that's what we're going to get onto soon. What they have actually done is this. So Indonesia has to do something. It's an issue. It's got people moving through its territory. So it initiated something called the Bali process. And that's literally what's called the Bali process. It's a non-binding agreement. So right there's alarm bells going off about them protecting their sovereignty. It's non-binding. You don't have to abide by any of the conditions in this. You can sign up to it and pick and choose what you like. Whereas with the treaty, it's binding. What does it actually seek to do? It seeks to eliminate people smuggling. It seeks to provide access to refugee assessment centres, and people who are found not to need protection are returned home to their country of origin.
how old is boats now?
They're old fishing boats, wooden fishing boats mostly.
They don't come back.
No, once they arrive, we burn them. But yeah, well, that's what you do with them, because then there's nothing left and there's just a few embers that fall towards the bottom of the water. Not that's been in the water for 30 years, no. but really old, shoddy wooden boats, and that's why so many of them sink on the way here.
How many do they know how many sink?
Well, I think there's a video coming up. It depends. It differs each year. I don't want to pick a number out of my head, but I will. It might be on the way to Australia, 50 to 100 each year die.
And how many make it?
Each year is different. I'd say on average a couple of thousand. Between 1 and 5,000 each year over the last 10 years make it here on the boats.
We take the most refugees.
No, we take in about 15 to 20,000. We saw Somalia, parts of Africa are taking in 600,000.
But aren't they trying to come here?
No, they're not.
Oh,
They're settled there. They're there. They're now going to live in Ethiopia and Uganda. So they're there now. They're all not trying to get here. It's a long way. It's a pretty hard trip to make it all the way here. No.
Is there actually some sovereign can't control boats in any waters, and then once they're in ours, you can't keep them out? Is there actually any way to stop it if they want to?
Well, they do want to, and they're trying to stop it.
How can you control?
That's why this is what the disagreement is about. What is the best way to stop it? And the two political parties are now almost have the exact same policy. So they used to disagree, and now they're almost exactly the same with how to stop it. So that their solution is to make it really harsh once you get here, and that'll be a disincentive for future people to come in. So let's put them in tents. But I guess they're thinking about the future as well. They're thinking, how do we stop people coming on bad boats and sinking on these boats?
Yeah.
Right. So of course, this unit is about power. What type of power is Indonesia using? It's a form of diplomatic power. They're working with other states in the region. Over 50 states have signed up to the Bali process. Yes. So their solution to sign the Bali process is an example of multilateral diplomacy. They want to work with states in the region to find solutions. So a regional solution to a regional problem is almost the catchphrases of the Bali process.
What was it?
Regional solution to a regional problem instead of a global solution to a regional problem. Sign the agreement, encouraging positive relations. This is a fancy picture of one of the most recent meetings of the. There's a theme here. It's mostly.
Wait, so is it a global problem?
Well, it is a global problem. There are global problems, but what the states in Southeast Asia are arguing is that the problem we're facing is a problem of our region, so our region needs to get together and try and solve it through the Bali process. So if we're optimists, we'd say that's great, it sounds good. If we were pessimists, we'd say, well, this is an excuse they're using to protect their sovereignty, to protect their rights to say and take in whoever they want, when they want. All of the states in Southeast Asia, almost none of them have signed the treaty. It's us. No, the international treaty. They've all signed the Bali process, but the Bali process is a nothing, it's just an agreement to meet and talk about stuff and an agreement to work together, but there's nothing binding it together. You don't actually have to do anything. So one clear type of power here is diplomacy. As far as foreign policy instruments go, the Bali process is an example of diplomacy in action. You've got many states, but you've also got diplomacy through working with the UN. Because of course, the UN has two bodies that relate to refugees, and both of these bodies work with the Bali process. So it's diplomacy working with other states, it's diplomacy working with the UN.
When you ask us a question, what's the difference between power and espionage?
I'm kind of delaying this until we get through all of our national interests to make the distinction, because it's a really fair question. They're pretty similar. Instruments are probably more specific to what a state actually does. So, for example, if you said military power, there are specific types of military power which can be used as instruments. So, to deploy troops, that's an example of an instrument that you can use. The deployment of troops is also an example of military power. So it's almost like you'd have military power at the top here, and that would filter down to ways in which the state can use it, and they're all instruments. Here's another one. There's economic power, but one instrument that the state can actually use is trade. So trade, by trading, yes, that's an example of military power, but it's a thing that the state can actually do. So instruments are more like things that the state does, and those things are examples of types of power. So you'd always put types of power at the top, and then they feed down into different specific instruments. All right. How effective has this been?
Wait, sorry, before we move on, I'm just confused how power and foreign policy instruments both diplomacy. If you just got a question about refugee policy, being repetitive, we're just talking about diplomacy.
Yep. The course design has decided that there's diplomatic power
and diplomatic.
Watch the video.
I'm
recording. So, the course has told us that diplomacy is an instrument the state can use. And that diplomacy is also an example of a type of power. So I haven't made this distinction the course has. There are 4 types of foreign policy instruments. So you might get a question which is specific to foreign policy instruments. So let's say, what foreign policy instrument has Indonesia used to solve the refugee crisis? And you say, well, it's used the foreign policy instrument diplomacy. It's working with states in the Asia Pacific region. So ignore power if you get a question about foreign policy instruments. What foreign policy instrument has Indonesia used to solve secession? Indonesia has used a foreign policy instrument of military power. It's deployed troops to West Papua to stop secession. What has it used to achieve the national interest of economic security? It's used trade in this way, this way, and this way. So depending on what the question is, you'll pivot towards one of these 4 or one of these 5. Now, I know it's a little confusing, but again, you're only going to get 3 types of question for this whole unit. One about national interest, one about power, one about foreign policy instruments.
Sorry, wait, we're only getting 1.
I'm saying that there are only really 3 types of question. And the question will direct you towards one of those streams. How effective has the response been? Totally ineffective. The boats keep coming, refugees keep moving through the region. So as far as solving the challenge of refugees and people movement, hasn't made a difference. If anything, Australia's had far more refugees arriving, and they're all coming from Indonesia. So the problem has gotten worse, and listen out for the next few months once the election campaign really fires up, because Abbott and the Liberals are just going to keep hitting the government over and over and over again on refugees, because the number of boats has gone up, the number of people arriving here has gone up dramatically. So it's going to be a political issue, suggesting this solution hasn't worked. Boats are still sinking. Sure, let's watch some footage.
Survivors of the latest asylum seeker boat tragedy are arriving on Christmas Island. So far, 109 men and a 13-year-old boy have been rescued, but 90 people are still missing. 3 bodies have been recovered, and surveillance planes have spotted many more bodies in the water. The boat capsized in Indonesia's search and rescue zone as it made its way towards Australia. The ABC's Jane Norman reports from Christmas Island.
3 asylum seekers were evacuated on board an RFDS plane bound for Perth, injured but lucky to be alive. They were rescued along with 100 others in waters north of Christmas Island. The full impact started being felt on the island last night. Survivors were flown in and treated in hospital. The Australian government says all those on board were male. One survivor was a 13-year-old boy.
We found about 40 people that were on top of the upturned hull, and other people that were holding on to debris as much as 3 nautical miles away from the scene. 4
merchant vessels, 2 Navy ships and 5 aircraft are involved in the search in the Indian Ocean, but they've only found bodies. Time is running out.
Morning's search has not recovered any survivors, unfortunately. We have had up to 6 vessels involved and 5 aircraft today, and we have confirmed sightings of deceased bodies, but none of survivors.
Earlier reports said the ship was en route from Sri Lanka, but the Home Affairs Minister said there appears to be mostly Afghans on board. The ship they were on issued a distress call and capsized 120 nautical miles north of Christmas Island yesterday afternoon.
Obviously, as is the case whenever there is deaths at sea, there'll be a full investigation to make sure that everything that should have been done was done.
And that's about as political as it got today.
This is a very distressing and tragic incident. We don't know the full details yet, but clearly we have lost a number of lives in a very dangerous journey from Indonesia to Australia.
This is a terrible, terrible tragedy. Our deepest sympathies have to be with everyone involved and caught up in this tragedy, and our support and encouragement for all the rescue personnel who are doing their best to minimise loss of life.
While it looks calm behind me, the rescue's happening about 100 nautical miles away where conditions are deteriorating. Authorities plan to continue the search until at least Saturday afternoon, but as time goes on, hopes of finding more survivors are fading. Jane Norman, ABC News, Christmas Island.
And Australian officials have now confirmed that there is another missing boat. The Maritime Authority has told the ABC that Indonesian authorities were sent a warning about a different boat on Sunday morning. Officials say they don't know what's happened to this second boat, and there'll be more on that story in Lakeline tonight.
So this is a weekly occurrence. There are multiple boats each week. This story you could replicate every couple of days. Now the media doesn't do that because people would get sick of seeing it. But it's obviously an issue in this region. It's an issue for Australia. We don't see much of this issue because we're so far away from Northern Australia. So as far as Indonesia's response, it's not working, nor is Australia's response for that matter. If I can put both sides of the argument, Indonesia with sovereignty, and then I'll go to the other side. So you could stand in Indonesia's shoes and say, it's our job to protect Indonesians, it's our job to protect our territory, to maintain control. Signing this treaty doesn't help us. It only adds more costs to our country, because we're going to have to look after refugees, we're going to have to take them in. And they're going to flock to our country because we're very spread out and we're a Muslim country, therefore Muslims from the Middle East are going to travel there. So we shouldn't accept any refugees, we shouldn't sign these treaties. They threaten our sovereignty, they're going to be expensive. On the other side, you could say that there's certain universal rights that should be protected. And they are protected in the UN Charter and they're protected in the UN Convention. And they're about protecting all people when they need protection. We might not need this particular protection, fear of persecution, fear that we'll be killed for our political beliefs. But there are some people who will, in some countries in the world. And so the more states that sign this treaty, the more states that will work together to solve this global problem. Because people movement occurs across borders. It's not an issue that occurs in one state, it occurs across borders, as we're realising right now with these boat people. So there's this tension between those two arguments.
What was the first one again?
Protecting sovereignty, maintaining control and power over your territory, versus having to sign up to a treaty which gives up some of that control. And so I have 3 questions for you. 4. The PowerPoint is on my classes, so you can grab them off there if you want and copy the questions off this into whatever Word document, OneNote thing you're doing. At this point, I might stop the video.
Bye.